What happens when a granddaughter tells her grandfather, "You're just a babysitter"? For most, it might sting for a moment and pass. But for James Whitaker, it sparked a lesson in love, sacrifice, and the hidden value of every hour spent together. From playful invoices on the fridge to heartfelt letters, from broken vases to lifelong pledges. This is the story of how one family discovered that time is priceless, dignity is chosen, and love is the only debt worth carrying. Would you charge your own grandchild to teach them what's truly invaluable? The morning began the way most of my mornings do, slow, steady, and with a whisper of habits that have been with me for decades. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint tick of the wall clock that has hung in the hallway since my children were small. Its hands moved with the same patient rhythm they always had, measuring time not in minutes but in memories. Today, it seemed to tick a little louder, as if reminding me that another day had arrived, another chance to show up for the people I loved. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the last button on my cardigan. The sweater itself was older than Lily, older even than the car parked in my driveway, but it had held up well. A deep navy, softened from years of washing. Its elbows were patched neatly by Margaret before her hands grew too shaky for needle and thread. Every morning, I button it with a kind of ceremony, tugging at the last button as though it were a final, not tying me to the day ahead. Today was no different. Beside the mirror lay my reading glasses. The frames a little bent from being dropped more than once on the porch, but still serviceable. I polished them with the corner of a handkerchief, holding them up to the light to check for streaks. I knew I'd need them later. Not just for squinting at Lily's homework, but for keeping my eyes sharp during Monopoly, where she had developed a knack for sneaking extra bills out of the bank when she thought I wasn't looking. I smiled faintly at the thought. She was clever, that girl, too clever for her own good some days. But that cleverness was part of her charm. Once the glasses were polished and perched on the bridge of my nose, I turned toward the kitchen. The kettle had already begun to hum, steam curling out of the spout in delicate ribbons. I set a mug on the counter, the one with the faint crack along the rim, and spooned in my instant coffee. Across the kitchen table, a row of snacks had already been lined up, apple slices sealed in a container, peanut butter crackers stacked in wax paper, and a single chocolate chip cookie that I knew Lily would find before anything else. It wasn't much, but I liked to think of it as a little welcome party waiting for her after school. A way to soften the hard edges of math tests and playground quarrels. On the living room shelf, the board games waited. Candyland, Monopoly, Scrabble, each box frayed at the corners, their colors fading, but their insides still full of stories. We had spent hours around that shelf, Lily and I, our laughter echoing through the house like it hadn't since her mother was a child. Those games weren't just pastimes. They were bridges. Every card flipped, every tile placed, every pretend fortune built was another plank laid across the gap of generations. The clock in the hallway struck the half hour, a sound both familiar and grounding. I listened as it rang out, low and steady, and let it settle me. That clock had been a witness to everything: late-night feedings, teenage arguments, tearful goodbyes, joyful reunions. Now it was witness to something quieter, smaller perhaps, but no less important. Mornings where I prepared myself to be a grandfather, a caretaker, a teacher, and, if Lily's words from yesterday were to be believed, just a babysitter. Phrase still stung, though I tried not to let it. Children repeat what they hear, often without knowing the weight of it. Still, as I buttoned my cardigan, polished my glasses, and arranged the snacks, I felt the ache of it settle in my chest. Was that all I had become? A placeholder, a convenience, someone to keep a child occupied until the real parents came home. The thought gnawed at me. Yet, even as it did, my hands continued their work. The cardigan buttoned, the cookie tucked neatly into its place, the board games aligned like soldiers on a shelf, because no matter the words, the work remained by the time the kettle whistled in earnest. I had finished my quiet morning rituals. I poured the hot water, stirred in the sugar, and took my first sip, the warmth spreading through me. Outside, the sun had just begun to rise, painting the edges of the windows in pale gold. The day stretched ahead, uncertain, but I was ready for it. Ready for Lily's chatter, her stubbornness, her questions that tumbled out faster than I could answer. Ready, even, for the sting of her careless words. I glanced at the mirror one last time before leaving the kitchen. The cardigan sat neatly on my shoulders, the last button holding fast. My glasses glinted faintly in the light, and in their reflection, I saw not just an old man preparing for another day, but a soldier of sorts reporting for duty in the small battlefield of love and patience. The clock ticked on, steady as always, marking the beginning of a day that would test me in ways I hadn't yet imagined. And so it began with a button, a cookie, a stack of board games, and the quiet resolve of a grandfather determined to show that even if the world called him just a babysitter, he was something far more enduring. He was family. The day had moved along like any other, predictable in its rhythm, ordinary in its shape. I picked Lily up from school, just as the last bell rang, the line of parents and grandparents stretching down the curb like a parade, without the floats. The air was warm, early spring, with the faint smell of cut grass carried on the breeze. I leaned on the steering wheel, watching as Lily came bounding down the steps, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her hair escaping its braid in wild, defiant strands. She spotted me quickly, waved, and ran across the pavement with the confidence of someone who knows they will always be met at the curb. I remember the way she flung her backpack into the back seat, climbed in, and slammed the door with more force than necessary. "Hi, Grandpa," she said, but the words came out flat, as if they had been pressed too thin by the weight of her day. "Long one?" I asked, pulling the car into gear. She shrugged. "Just school." That was her answer for everything these days, just school. It carried the same vague tone her mother used to have when I asked about teenage parties or slammed doors. I let the silence stretch a while, filling it with the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the turn signal. It was halfway home, at a red light, that the remark slipped out. Lily had been fiddling with her phone, thumbs flying across the screen, her face set in that peculiar mixture of focus and disinterest only 10-year-olds can master. Without looking up, she said, "Mom says you're just our babysitter anyway." Just like that. No warning, no malice that I could detect. Just a blunt declaration, tossed into the air like a gum wrapper. But the words hit me like a stone, gripped the wheel a little tighter, feeling the familiar ache in my knuckles. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. "What did you say?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, steady. She shrugged again, her eyes still on the glowing screen. "That you're like a babysitter. You watch me till Mom gets home. That's all." The light turned green, and I pressed the accelerator, my mind churning faster than the car's wheels. Just a babysitter. As though the years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, bandaged, piano recitals attended, and endless rides to school and back could be folded neatly into that single word, babysitter. I said nothing for the rest of the drive. My silence hung in the car like fog, thick and heavy. Lily didn't notice, or, if she did, she didn't show it. She tapped at her phone, humming occasionally to some tune I couldn't hear. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and in that moment, I saw not malice but innocence. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was repeating what she'd heard, without yet knowing how words could carry weight far heavier than their syllables. When we pulled into the driveway, she bolted from the car, running up the porch steps 2 at a time. I lingered behind, shutting the door slowly, my hand resting on the roof of the car, longer than necessary. Babysitter. The word echoed, each repetition cutting deeper, each syllable stripping away years of sacrifice. Inside, Lily had already torn into the snacks I'd left out, the cookie half-eaten crumbs dotting the table. "Thanks, Grandpa," she said between bites, cheerful now, as though nothing had happened. I watched her, the cardigan snug around my shoulders, my glasses slipping slightly down my nose. She looked so young, so unaware of the storm her words had stirred. I felt the urge to correct her, to remind her that I was more than a placeholder, more than a watchful eye in the hours between school and bedtime. But I swallowed the words. Instead, I walked to the hallway, where the old clock ticked with its faithful rhythm. I stood there, listening, letting the sound ground me. Babysitter. No, I thought. Caretaker. Witness. Grandfather. Mattered weren't diminished by the careless words of a tired child. Still, the sting lingered. Later, when the house was quiet again, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and an old ledger book. I wrote the date neatly, at the top of the page. Beneath it, I wrote, "Hours with Lily." My hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from resolve. If she thought I was a babysitter, then perhaps it was time she learned what that truly meant: the cost of hours, the value of presence, the arithmetic of care. The words she had spoken could not be unsaid, but they could be answered, not with anger, not with scolding, but with a lesson carved in ink and time. And so, as the clock ticked on and the house held its breath, I drew the first line of a new account. The account of what it meant to love a child in the margins of their understanding. The account of what it meant to be seen, not as just a babysitter, but as something far more enduring. That night, long after Lily had gone upstairs with her backpack and her cookie crumbs, I sat alone in the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, punctuated now and then by the soft creak of the house settling into its bones. On the table before me lay a book I hadn't opened in years, the old family ledger. Its leather cover was cracked at the edges, its spine bent from decades of service. I ran my hand across it, the way you'd run your hand across the bark of a familiar tree, feeling the grooves, the wear, the history. This ledger had been our family's quiet companion through every season of life. Grocery lists were penciled into its margins. Household expenses, wedding costs, hospital bills, all neatly recorded in the tidy handwriting of my late wife, Margaret. She had a way of making even numbers look graceful, as if she could dress arithmetic in Sunday clothes. I pulled it closer and opened it to a blank page near the back. The paper had yellowed, fragile at the corners, but it still smelled faintly of ink and dust, the way an honest record should. For a long while, I simply stared at it, the pen in my hand hovering above the lines. The words Lily had spoken in the car replayed themselves in my mind. You're just a babysitter. Each time they returned, they seemed to dig deeper, not in anger, but in ache. Children don't understand the weight of their words. Not at 10 years old. Not when they're just beginning to test the edges of the world. But still, I felt the need to answer her. Not with scolding. Not with lectures. But with something that would outlive the moment. Something she could hold in her hands when she was old enough to understand. So I began to write at the top of the page. I set the date. Below it, in letters more deliberate than my hand usually allowed, I wrote, "Hours with Lily." My chest tightened as the words dried into the paper. For the first time, I was putting into numbers what had always been given freely. I made the first entry. Pickup from school 1 hour. Rate, $10. It wasn't about the money. I had no intention of ever collecting. But there was something about setting the value on paper, assigning weight to the invisible, that steadied me. For years, I had given my time as naturally as breathing, as though presence itself had no cost. But presence does cost. It costs a bending of knees on rainy sidewalks, the hours spent at piano recitals, the meals eaten cold so homework could be finished first. I added more lines. Homework help 1.5 hours. Rate, $15. Snack preparations, 0.5 hours. Rate, $5. Games and reading 2 hours. Rate, $20. By the time I finished, the page had filled with neat little rows, each one representing a slice of the day. The total at the bottom looked larger than I expected. I stared at it, not as a bill, but as a reflection of love measured in hours instead of hugs. When I was a boy, I remember my father laying his pay stubs on the kitchen table, folding them carefully before sliding them into the family Bible. Every dollar tells a story, he used to say. Back then, I thought he meant survival, keeping the lights on, keeping food on the table. But now, staring at the ledger, I realized that every hour tells a story, too. And these were the stories Lily needed to learn. That time given is never free, though it may be given freely. I closed the book gently, the pen resting across its spine like a bookmark. The decision had been made. From now on, I would keep track, not to collect, not to accuse, but to teach. If she thought I was just a babysitter, then I would let her see what a babysitter really means. I would show her, page by page, that love is labor, and labor has value. The clock in the hallway struck 9. Its steady chime echoed through the house, reminding me that another day had ended, another one soon to begin. I pushed the ledger to the center of the table, where it would be waiting in the morning, patient and unassuming. And as I turned out the kitchen light, I felt something shift inside me. The sting of her words hadn't vanished, but it had found purpose. I wasn't just keeping a record of hours. I was keeping a record of love, a love that would teach, even if it had to wait for understanding. Morning sunlight slipped through the curtains, painting faint stripes across the kitchen table where the ledger still rested. I sat down with a steaming mug of coffee and ran my hand across its worn cover. The words I had written the night before, "Hours with Lily," waited quietly on the page, reminding me of the task I had set for myself. Yet, as I traced the ink with my finger, memories began to rise, unbidden and insistent. Worth, that was what this was really about. Not babysitting, not hours, not even the arithmetic of care. It was about the worth of time, the worth of labor, the worth of love. And I knew exactly where I had first learned those lessons. I was no older than Lily when I began to notice how my parents measured worth in their own way. My father worked long shifts at the mill, his hands scarred by years of gripping hot steel. He never spoke much about exhaustion, though I saw it in the way he sat at the table. Shoulders slumped, after 12 hours on the floor. When he got paid, he would come home with a thin envelope of bills folded into his pocket. He'd slide it onto the table, right beside the Bible, and tell my mother, "Here it is. Every hour I worked, right here." And my mother, apron still dusted with flour, would take that envelope as though it were holy. She would count each bill carefully, not because she doubted him, but because she understood that every crease in that money carried part of him, the hours he missed dinners, the sweat that soaked through his shirt, the skin rubbed raw from labor. I remembered one night in particular. The ledger had been sitting on the table then too, though it was newer, its pages crisp. My mother had opened it to a blank page and begun writing numbers in neat columns. She recorded the groceries bought, the electric bill paid, the shoes ordered for school, and I asked her, "Why do you write it all down? Can't you just remember?" She looked at me over her spectacles, her eyes tired but gentle. "Because if I don't write it down, people forget what things cost," she said. "Not just money, but the work behind it. Writing it makes it real." That night stayed with me. It was the first time I realized that the worth of something isn't just in what it looks like, or what it costs at the store. It's in the effort, the sacrifice, the unseen hours that make it possible. Later in life, when I married Margaret, those lessons followed me. I remember her standing at the kitchen counter late at night, slipping tip money into a jar after waitressing long hours. "It's not much," she'd say, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But I'd see the tiredness in her eyes and the strength in her back, and I knew better. It was more than much. It was dignity made visible in quarters and crumpled bills. As I sat at the table that morning, the house quiet except for the steady tick of the hallway clock, I thought of how easily worth can be hidden when it comes in the form of care. Meals made, rides given, nights spent sitting beside a sick child. Those things don't come with pay stubs or tip jars. They vanish into the folds of memory, unnoticed until someone dares to call it just babysitting. I opened the ledger again and stared at the entries I had made. To anyone else, they might look strange, even petty. An hour for pickup, 2 for games, half for snacks, but I knew what they were. They were reminders, just as my father's envelope reminded us of his hours, just as my mother's columns reminded us of her sacrifices. This ledger would remind Lily one day that love is not empty. Love is worth. I leaned back in my chair, the mug warm in my hands, and whispered to myself what my father once told me. Every dollar tells a story, only now, I would amend it. Every hour tells a story, too. And as I closed the ledger gently, I realized that perhaps this was less about teaching Lily a lesson, and more about preserving one myself, the old lesson of worth, carried from my parents, through me, and now, hopefully, into her. The decision sat with me for a full day before I found the right moment to put it into practice. It was Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when time moves slowly, stretching like warm molasses. Lily sprawled across the living room rug, her hair in a messy ponytail, her socks mismatched. Her attention split between coloring a picture and humming a tune I couldn't place. The light from the window fell across her like a blessing, though she didn't notice. Children rarely notice the way the world conspires to cradle them. I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open, the pen resting across its spine, waiting for courage to settle in me. This wasn't anger, not even close. It was something softer, more deliberate, though no less firm. I wanted her to see. I wanted her to understand. But I also wanted her to feel loved in the middle of it. Lessons without tenderness become lectures, and lecturers rarely land in young hearts. "Lily," I called, my voice steady, casual. "Can you come here a minute?" She padded into the kitchen, dragging a crayon in her hand like a soldier reluctant to give up her weapon. "What's up, Grandpa?" I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit with me. I want to show you something." She plopped down, resting her elbows on the table, and eyed the ledger with suspicion. "Is that your boring book again?" I smiled. Faintly. Maybe boring, maybe not. Depends on how you look at it. I tapped the page where I'd written the entries. "You remember what you said the other day? About me being just a babysitter?" Her cheeks flushed. She shrugged, eyes dropping to her crayon. "I didn't mean it like bad. That's what Mom said." I know. My tone was gentle, but my words carried weight. And I'm not upset. But words like that mean something, so I thought maybe I'd show you what it means when someone says babysitter. Her eyes lifted, curious now. I turned the ledger toward her. See here. This is the time I spend with you. I wrote it down. Snacks, homework, games, picking you up from school. I gave each thing a value. The way babysitters get paid. She leaned closer, reading the neat rows. Her lips moved as she sounded out the words, her brow furrowing when she saw the totals. $20. For Monopoly. I chuckled softly. 2 hours. Babysitters usually get paid by the hour. And Monopoly, as you know, can go on forever. Her eyes widened. So if I had to pay you, I'd owe like $100 already. More than that, I said, tapping the page. But don't worry, I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for something else. Her shoulders relaxed, but her curiosity sharpened. Like what? I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table. Respect, that's all. I want you to understand that time matters, that care matters, that being here with you isn't just babysitting. It's part of my life. A big part. She chewed on her lip, the crayon rolling back and forth under her palm. For a long moment. She didn't speak. Then she asked in a smaller voice, "So, how do I pay you?" The question hit me harder than I expected. There was no defensiveness in it, no sarcasm, just genuine uncertainty. I felt my throat tighten. "You pay me," I said carefully, by saying thank you, by remembering that this time we spend together is worth something. That's better than money. That's worth more than anything. Her face softened, and she nodded slowly. Then, without warning, she reached across the table and placed her small hand on mine. The warmth of it spread through me like sunlight, breaking through a cloud. "Okay, Grandpa," she said. "I'll pay you like that." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Then she grinned mischievously, pulling her hand back. "But if you're charging me, I'm charging you for coloring lessons. $1 a page." I laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet kitchen. "Fair enough," I said. And just like that, the ledger became something more than a lesson. It became a contract between us, not written in strict terms, but in tenderness. A promise that love could be measured, not in dollars, but in respect. That night, as I closed the ledger and set it aside, I felt lighter. The sting of her words hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. Where once there had been ache, now there was hope. The hope that Lily would grow to see the invisible hours, the unseen sacrifices, the quiet love that had carried her this far. As the clock ticked in the hallway, steady as a drumbeat, I realized that sometimes the hardest lessons are the simplest ones. Not about money, not about contracts, but about worth. And worth, when taught with tenderness, has a way of lasting forever. The very next Monday, the experiment began. I told myself it was just an exercise, a gentle way of showing Lily what her words had stirred in me. But the truth was, my heart beat a little faster when I reached for the ledger that morning. It felt like stepping onto a stage, though the only audience was a 10-year-old girl with crayons still under her fingernails. I picked her up from school as usual, pulling into the same cracked parking lot I had parked in for months. Parents bustled in and out of their cars, some honking in impatience, others waving frantically as their children came running. Lily emerged from the cluster of students, her backpack tilted sideways, her braid undone by the wind. She spotted me, and this time, instead of bounding straight into the car, she slowed. I saw the hesitation in her eyes and awareness that something had shifted between us. "Hi, Grandpa," she said cautiously, sliding into the back seat. "Hi, Lily," I answered, handing her a bottle of water. "How was your day?" "Fine," she muttered, but then added, Are you starting the clock now?" Her question nearly made me laugh. Instead, I nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am. The first hour begins when you leave school and ends when your homework is finished. That's what babysitters usually do." She rolled her eyes, but I noticed the corners of her mouth twitching. "Okay, fine. But I'm keeping track to..." The drive home was ordinary stoplights, chatter about classmates, a brief silence when she stared out the window. But it all felt different, as though every minute was magnified. When we pulled into the driveway, I checked my watch with exaggerated care. 20 minutes for the ride, I announced, added to the ledger. She groaned. "That's not fair. You were driving for yourself too." "Maybe," I said, smiling. "But the purpose of the trip was you. That's what makes it believable." Inside the house, the ritual of after-school life unfolded as always. I set out the snacksable slices and peanut butter crackers while she dropped her backpack with a thud. She munched the cookie first, naturally, crumbs sprinkling across the table like confetti. But between bites, she kept glancing at the clock on the wall, as if testing whether I was serious. Homework came next. Math worksheets today, multiplication tables. She spread them across the table, groaning as though each problem were a punishment. I sat beside her, pointing to the columns, guiding her through the steps. When she grew frustrated, I told her the same thing I used to tell her mother. Numbers don't like being rushed. Treat them patiently, and they'll tell you their secrets. She gave me a sidelong glance. That's weird, Grandpa. Maybe, I said, but it works. And slowly, it did. She finished the last problem, dropped her pencil dramatically, and declared, done. I looked at my watch again. 40 minutes. That brings us to 1 full hour. Congratulations, young lady. You've just completed your first billable session. She giggled, despite herself. A sound so pure it cut straight through the residue of her remark days earlier. So how much do I owe? I tapped the ledger. $10. But remember, I accept alternative forms of payment. She tilted her head. Suspicious. Like what? Chores. Kind words. Maybe an extra hug at bedtime. She groaned again, louder this time, but her eyes shone with mischief. Fine. But hugs don't count as money. Ah, I said. But they're worth more than money. Her laughter filled the kitchen, bouncing off the cabinets, mixing with the tick of the hallway clock. And as I wrote down that first entry in the ledger, 1 hour, pickup, snack, homework, I realized something important. The exercise wasn't just for her. It was for me too. To remind myself that love, though given freely, still carries value. That showing up day after day is worth recording, not because anyone owes me, but because it deserves to be seen. When bedtime came, she surprised me. After brushing her teeth and slipping under the covers, she reached out with both arms. Here, she said softly. This hug is on the house. I bent down, embraced her, and whispered, best payment I've ever received. And with that, the first hour was complete, measured not in dollars, not in arithmetic, but in the currency of love disguised as a ledger entry. The following Saturday dawned bright and warm. A rare gift in early spring. I could hear birds outside the window before I even buttoned the first clasp on my cardigan. The cardigan, the glasses, the canal, the old soldiers of my morning ritual, marched with me to the kitchen table, where the ledger waited. Pages now bore the neat tally of our first experiment. 1 hour logged, $10 written, and Lily's hesitant but genuine hug filed in my heart as payment. When Lily arrived, she seemed to carry herself differently, as though the air between us had shifted. She glanced at the ledger, the way one might glance at a teacher's grade, but wary, but curious. What are we doing today? She asked, dropping her backpack by the door. Well, I said, folding my glasses into place, that depends. Would you like to pay for an hour of Monopoly, or do you prefer Candyland? Monopoly is a bigger investment. Candyland is shorter, cheaper. She squinted at me, then broke into a grin. You're making board games cost money. I shrugged. Time is money, so they say. And Monopoly eats time like nothing else. She laughed, then planted her hands on her hips. Fine, Monopoly, but I'm charging you if I win. Ah, I said, already fetching the box from the shelf. Now you're beginning to understand wages. We spread the game across the dining table, the board frayed at the edges, the paper money soft from years of use. Lily picked the dog, as always, and I took the top hat. The same piece I had chosen since her mother was a child. The first few turns rolled by icily, dice clattering, tokens marching forward. But as the game stretched on, Lily's attention wandered. She hummed, stacked the money into pyramids, leaned back in her chair with a sigh. How much is this costing me now? She asked, a hint of dread in her voice. Let's see. I glanced at the clock. We've been at it for an hour and 15 minutes. That's $12.50 at the going babysitter's rate. Her eyes widened. For this, that's robbery. I chuckled. Not robbery. Time has value, even when it's wrapped in fun. She frowned, then leaned forward, suddenly serious. But you like playing with me, don't you? Doesn't that make it free? The question hung in the air like a feather refusing to fall. I set the dice down gently and looked at her. I love playing with you, Lily. That's true. But free doesn't mean worthless. Do you see the difference? She tilted her head, thinking. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind. So, even if you enjoy it, it still counts. Yes, I said. Because it's still my time. Time is the most valuable thing we have. You don't get it back once it's gone. That's why we measure it carefully. She tapped her chin with a tiny dog token. So every time we play a game, or you help me with homework, or make me snacks, that's worth something. That's exactly it. Her eyes softened. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't argue. She just looked at me, and in her gaze I caught a glimpse of something new, respect. Then, just as quickly, her mischief returned. Fine, she said, grinning. But if I land on Boardwalk, you're giving me a discount. We both laughed, and the game resumed. Dice rolled. Fortunes rose and fell. Paper bills slid across the table. But beneath it all, something deeper had taken root. The ledger had done its work, not by demanding payment, but by sparking recognition. When we finally packed the game away, 2 hours logged, $20 added to the tally. Lily slipped her arms around me in a quick hug. Thanks, Grandpa, she whispered. Best babysitter ever. The words still stung, but less now, softened by the way she said them. Not as dismissal, but as affection. And as I wrote the entry into the ledger that evening, I realized the real wages weren't measured in dollars at all. They were measured in laughter across a worn-out board, in the sparkle of a child's eyes when understanding dawned, in the quiet shift of love becoming respect. That was payment enough. The lesson deepened the next week, not through games or homework, but through the quiet business of chores. Saturday mornings in my house had always carried a rhythm of their own, dust motes drifting in shafts of light, the vacuum humming, laundry tumbling in the machine like a restless sea. Margaret and I had built that rhythm together once. Now, it was mine to keep, steady as the old clock in the hallway. Lily arrived mid-morning, her shoes muddy from a quick dash through the yard. She dropped her backpack with a thud, called a cheerful hi Grandpa, and went straight to the fridge for juice. When she noticed the broom leaning against the counter, she wrinkled her nose. Are we cleaning? She asked. Suspicious. Indeed. We are, I said, adjusting my glasses. Babysitters don't just sit, you know. They keep a house running. And today, my assistant will be helping. Her jaw dropped. Assistant, Grandpa. That sounds like chores. It is chores, I said with a grin. But don't worry, you'll get credit in the ledger. Every babysitter needs an apprentice. She groaned dramatically, slumping against the counter as though I'd asked her to scale a mountain. What do I get if I help? Experience, I said. And, if you're lucky, extra respect points. She raised an eyebrow. Respect. Points don't sound like money. No, I replied, but they're worth more in the long run. We began with the living room. I handed her a dust rag and showed her how to run it along the baseboards. She did it grudgingly at first, dragging the cloth like it weighed 10 pounds. But soon, she discovered the satisfaction of wiping away a streak of grime, revealing the clean wood beneath. Look, she said, holding up the rag, now gray with dust. I'm winning. Exactly, I said. Every clean line is a small victory. Next came the laundry. I showed her how to separate colors from whites, explaining the logic behind it the way I once explained it to her mother. She listened more closely than I expected, nodding with a seriousness that made her look older than 10. So it's like sorting Legos, she said finally. If you mix them up, it's harder to build. Precisely, I replied, surprised at her metaphor. Sorting is half the work. The hours slipped by. We folded towels together, stacked them in neat piles, then moved to the kitchen to wash dishes. She hummed while rinsing, splashing more water onto the floor than into the sink, but her laughter filled the room. And I let it be. When at last we sat down for lunch, grilled cheese sandwiches. Simple and warm. She leaned back with a sigh. That was so much work. Do you know how much you owe me, Grandpa? I chuckled. Funny, I was about to say the same thing. Her eyes lit with mischief. Okay, let's see. 1 hour of dusting, 1 hour of laundry, half an hour of dishes. That's like $25. I raised an eyebrow. You've been paying attention. Of course I have, she said, grinning. I'm not letting you keep all the wages. We struck a bargain then and there. I wrote the chores into the ledger, but beside each entry, I noted her contribution. Assistant rate, $5 per hour. She laughed. That's so unfair. I did all the hard work. Welcome to the world of wages, I said gently. But one day, when you set the rates, you'll understand the balance better. That evening, after she had gone, I reviewed the ledger. For the first time, her name appeared beside mine. A partner in the arithmetic of time, not just a child consuming hours, but a worker investing them. And I realized something then. The lesson was no longer just mine to teach. It had become ours to share. The chores were finished, the towels folded, the dishes gleaming. But what lingered wasn't the clean house. It was the sight of Lily's small hands, smoothing a towel with the same care her grandmother once had. The echo of her laughter in the kitchen. The pride in her voice when she declared her wages. In that balance between labor and love, between lessons and laughter, we had both earned something worth keeping. By the middle of the week, the ledger had taken on a life of its own. What began as an experiment had turned into a kind of ritual. Every visit, every chore, every board game was logged with neat precision. Lily had grown fascinated by the numbers, hovering at my elbow as though the columns of hours and rates contained secret codes. I could see the wheels turning in her head, curiosity sharpening into understanding. It was Thursday evening when I decided to take the lesson one step further. After she'd finished her math homework and the clock ticked past 7, I walked to the refrigerator, tore a sheet from the notepad hanging on its side, and began writing. Lily leaned on the counter, chewing on the end of her pencil, suspicious, but intrigued. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Preparing your bill," I replied calmly, adjusting my glasses. Her eyes went wide. "My bill, that's right. Babysitters don't just keep ledgers, they give invoices. Otherwise, no one remembers what's owed." She hopped off the stool and hurried over, craning her neck to see. I wrote carefully, my pen steady against the notepad. Invoice for services rendered pickup from school. $10 homework assistance. $15 snack preparation. $5 board game supervision. $20 household chores with assistant. $25 total due. $75. I signed it at the bottom. Grandpa Whitaker, babysitter-in-chief. Lily gasped dramatically, pressing both hands to her cheeks. $75. That's robbery. I turned the paper toward her and tapped the numbers. That's what 3 afternoons and 1 Saturday morning add up to. Babysitting isn't cheap, young lady. She groaned, but there was laughter bubbling under it. I don't have $75. Then we'll need to arrange alternate payment. I folded the invoice neatly and walked it to the refrigerator, affixing it with a magnet shaped like a smiling apple. The paper fluttered slightly. In the draft from the open window, standing there like a banner of truth, Lily stared at it, aghast. "You can't just put that there." "Why not?" I asked. "Bills go where people can see them. Otherwise, they get forgotten." She stomped her foot lightly, though her grin betrayed her. "Mom's going to see it." "I hope she does," I said, settling back into my chair. She ought to know the going rate for her father's services. For a moment, silence stretched. She studied the invoice, her lips moving as she added the numbers again, checking for errors. Then she turned to me, eyes narrowing. "Okay, Grandpa, I'll pay you." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yes," she said firmly. "I'll pay with hugs. 10 hugs for pickup, 15 for homework, 5 for snacks, 24 games, and 25 for chores." I chuckled. "That's 75 hugs, Lily." She grinned, mischievous. "Better get ready." And before I could respond, she lunged forward and wrapped her arms around me in a tight squeeze. "That's 1, she said, pulling back just far enough to grin before hugging me again. "That's 2. By the time she reached 10, both of us were laughing so hard the neighbors probably heard. She tried to speed through them, hugs that left me breathless. But eventually she slowed, resting her head against my chest. "I'll keep paying," she murmured, "even after the bill is gone." My throat tightened, and I pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "That's the best deal I've ever made." Later that night, after she had gone home, I stood in the kitchen staring at the invoice still pinned to the fridge. To anyone else, it might have looked like a joke, numbers on a page, signed with a flourish. But to me, it was proof. Proof that value had been seen, that love had been measured not in dismissal but in laughter. In 75 hugs counted out one by one. And as the house settled into its nighttime hush, I realized that maybe the bill wasn't for Lily at all. Maybe it was for me, a reminder that even when words sting, even when the world calls you just a babysitter, there are ways to turn hurt into humor, lessons into love. The ledger kept the hours. The invoice kept the truth. But the hugsat was the real payment. Sunday mornings had their own rhythm in my house, and Lily knew it well. The smell of frying butter, the hiss of batter hitting a hot griddle, the low hum of the radio tuned to the oldies station. Those were the sounds and scents that shaped our ritual. Margaret and I had started it long before Lily was born. Pancakes were our family's way of slowing time, of gathering everyone at the table before the week scattered us again. That morning, as I ladled the batter into round, imperfect circles, Lily sat at the counter swinging her legs, her eyes fixed on the refrigerator. The invoice still hung there, secured by the smiling apple magnet. Its corners curled slightly in the kitchen warmth, but the bold letters remained. Total due, $75. She pointed at it with her fork. Grandpa, are you really going to keep that bill up there forever? Of course, I said, flipping a pancake with more flair than necessary. It's official business. Bills stay visible until they're paid. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, but I already gave you, 20 hugs. That's a down payment. True, I admitted, stacking pancakes onto a plate, but the balance is still outstanding. She giggled, then leaned her chin into her palms. Okay, but you have to admit hugs are better than money. I slid the plate in front of her, golden pancakes steaming. On that point, I said, we are in perfect agreement. We ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sound, the clink of forks and the sizzle of the last pancake browning in the pan. After a few bites, Lily spoke again, softer this time. Grandpa, do you really think babysitting is worth all that money? I paused, setting down the spatula. Her question wasn't mischievous now. It was earnest, heavy in the air between us. I sat across from her and folded my hands on the table. It's not about money. Lily, babysitting, taking care of someone means giving time, and time is the most precious thing we have. Once it's gone, you can't earn it back. She frowned, slightly, tracing circles in the syrup on her plate. But you're my grandpa. You'd spend time with me anyway. That's true, I said gently, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But sometimes people forget that love takes work too. Driving, cooking, helping with homework, folding laundry, those things take hours. And hours add up. I just wanted you to see that they matter. She nodded slowly, a fork hovering above the pancakes. So the bill on the fridge is like a reminder. Exactly, I said, smiling. Not to make you feel bad, just to help you remember that care has value, even when it looks ordinary. For a while, she didn't answer. Then, with surprising seriousness, she slid half her pancake onto my plate. Here, she said. Payment, I chuckled. Half a pancake won't cover $75. She tilted her head, her grin returning. But it's worth more than money, right? I looked at her, the way her hair fell into her eyes, the way she held her fork like a sword, and I felt Margaret's presence in the room. She would have laughed at this little bargain, her laugh like church bells on a sunny morning. You're right, I said softly. This is worth more than money. After breakfast, we washed the dishes together, Lily standing on a stool beside me, bubbles clinging to her arms. She hummed as she worked, the seriousness of our conversation melting back into childhood play, but every so often, her eyes flicked to the fridge, to the bill that fluttered there, like a flag. Later that evening, when the house was quiet again, I walked into the kitchen and stood before it. The total still read $75, unpaid, but I didn't move to take it down. I left it there not as a debt, but as a lesson. A reminder that pancakes, hugs, and hours all have their own kind of currency. And as the old clock in the hallway chimed the hour, I realized that maybe the bill would never truly be paid, and maybe that was the point. The following Tuesday, Lily arrived at my house after school, with the usual clatter backpack hitting the floor, shoes squeaking on the linoleum, her voice carrying down the hallway like a herald's trumpet. But this time, she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was Mrs. Collins from next door, the kind of neighbor who never missed a chance to raise an eyebrow at whatever business crossed her path. I saw Lily walking, Mrs. Collins said, adjusting her cardigan. Figured I'd walk her over since you were out front checking the mail. Much obliged, I said, giving her a nod. Always glad to know someone's watching out. Her eyes slid past me into the kitchen, sharp as a hawk's. That was when she saw the invoice pinned to the fridge with the apple magnet. Her brow arched so high I thought it might never return to its natural place. What on earth is that? She asked, stepping closer. Lily burst into laughter before I could answer. That's my bill. Grandpa says I owe him $75 for babysitting. Mrs. Collins blinked. Babysitting. You're her grandfather. I smiled faintly, leaning on my cane. And a grandfather who babysits is still a babysitter. The hours don't change just because love is involved. She pursed her lips, clearly unsure whether to scold me or laugh. Well, I've heard of teaching kids responsibility, but that's a new one. Lily grinned, pointing proudly at the paper. I'm paying him in hugs. 75 of them. Mrs. Collins' eyebrow finally lowered, though her mouth twitched. That's quite a rate. I shrugged. Best currency there is. Beats a check any day. With that, she excused herself. muttering something about telling her sister at church. As the door closed, Lily collapsed into a chair, giggling so hard she nearly toppled over. "Did you see her face?" she squealed. "She thought you were serious." "I am serious," I said, tapping the fridge gently. "Every bit of it." Her laughter softened, and she tilted her head. "Do you think she'd tell people?" "Maybe," I said. "And that's fine. Let them laugh. What matters is you and me, we know what it means." She rested her chin on her hands, her smile fading into thoughtfulness. "It's like, other people don't see all the hours, do they?" "No," I said quietly, sliding into the chair across from her. "Most people never notice the hours that go into caring. They see the result, the clean house, the fed child, the homework done, but they don't see the time behind it. That's why I keep the bill there. It's a reminder, even if it makes eyebrows rise." She tapped the table thoughtfully, then whispered, "I see it now, Grandpa." The word struck me harder than Mrs. Collins' eyebrow ever could. We spent the rest of the evening quietly as she working on a puzzle, me sipping tea, but something lingered between us, a shared secret. The invoice on the fridge wasn't just paper anymore. It was a declaration, a banner of sorts, telling anyone who cared to look that time and love carried weight. Later, when I walked her to the porch where her mother waited, Lily tugged at my sleeve. "Don't take it down," she whispered. "Leave it there, so everyone who comes in sees it." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. That night, when the house fell into its steady hush, I stood in the kitchen staring at the paper. Once more, Mrs. Collins' raised eyebrow had been the world's way of asking, "Why bother?" Lily's words had been the answer, "Because I see it now," and that was enough to keep the bill right where it was. The rain came on a Thursday, steady and gray, turning the world outside into a watercolor painting blurred at the edges. Drops streaked down the windows, racing each other toward the sill. The old house creaked with the weight of the storm, gutters gurgling, the porch dripping like a leaky faucet. It was the kind of day when everything slows, when even the clocks seemed to tick more softly. Lily trudged in after school, her shoes squeaking, her hair damp and curling at the edges. She dropped her backpack with its usual thud and sighed so heavily it seemed to come from her toes. "Long day?" I asked, taking her jacket to hang on the peg. "The longest," she grumbled. "Math test, soggy lunch, and now it's raining so hard we can't even play outside." "Ah," I said, guiding her toward the kitchen. "Then it's a perfect day for reckoning." She squinted at me. "Reckoning? That sounds scary." I smiled faintly, reaching for the ledger that lay waiting on the counter. "Not scary. Just honest. Rainy days are good for looking at what we've done and what it's worth." Her eyes lit with recognition. "The ledger again. The ledger again," I confirmed. We settled at the table, the rain tapping like a metronome on the roof above. I flipped through the pages, the ink lines neat and steady, each entry a small testament to the hours we'd spent. Pick up from school, homework help, pancake breakfasts, board games, chores. Each item carried its number, its weight, its quiet dignity. Lily leaned close, tracing the rows with her finger. "It's getting long," she murmured. "Because love takes time," I said softly. "And time leaves its record, even if most people never write it down." She bit her lip, thinking, "So, how much do I owe you now?" I did a quick tally in my head, then slid the pencil down the column. "Let's call it $120. Her eyes went wide. $120. That's like a whole Nintendo Switch. I chuckled, sipping my tea. Or 12 trips to the grocery store. Or a month of electric bills. Numbers always carry choices with them. She groaned, dropping her head onto her folded arms. "I'll never pay that off." I reached over and ruffled her damp hair. "You already have, in ways that matter. But the ledger is there to remind us both. The hours aren't free, even if the love is." She lifted her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Grandpa, do you think Mom owes you too?" For when she was little, the question landed like thunder. I leaned back, my cane tapping softly against the floor. "Yes," I said finally. "She owes me plenty. But she's already paid, in ways she may not even realize. Every time she works hard, every time she loves you fiercely, she's paying forward what she learned." Lily thought about that for a long time, her gaze drifting to the rain sliding down the window. "So it's not about money at all, is it?" "No," I said quietly. "It's about value. About seeing what's given, even when it's ordinary. The world forgets to look at the hours. I don't want you to forget." She nodded slowly, then reached for the pencil. "Then I want to write something in the ledger." I hesitated, but slid it toward her. She gripped the pencil awkwardly, tongue between her teeth, and wrote in large, crooked letters beneath my neat lines, "Payment, 120 hugs. One already given, 119 to go." She looked up, grinning despite the gloom. "See, I'm keeping track too." My throat tightened. I closed the ledger gently, pressing my hand over her words. "Fair enough," I whispered. The rain drummed harder, the house wrapped in its watery song. And in that quiet kitchen, with the storm pressing close, I realized the reckoning wasn't about numbers at all. It was about love tallied honestly, love made visible. And sometimes, all it takes is a rainy day to see it clear. Saturday mornings usually carried the promise of sunshine, but this one was especially golden. The storm from earlier in the week had rinsed the air clean, and by mid-morning, the neighborhood hummed with the sound of mowers and children's laughter. Lily bounded into my kitchen, her sneakers already smudged with chalk from drawing hopscotch squares on the driveway. "Grandpa," she announced breathlessly, "I want to set up a lemonade stand today. Can we please?" I raised an eyebrow, stirring sugar into my tea. "A lemonade stand? That sounds suspiciously like a business venture." She grinned. "Exactly. I'll make money. And then I can pay off part of my babysitting bill." The thought made me chuckle. "Well now, that changes everything. If you're going into business, you'll need a contract." Her face lit with curiosity, like a real one. "Of course," I said, reaching for the ledger. "Every business starts with an agreement. Otherwise, people forget who owes what." We sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming across the pages. I drew a line across a clean sheet and began to write in my careful hand. "Lemonade. Stand contract. This contract is made between Lily Whitaker, hereafter, the entrepreneur, and James Whitaker, hereafter, the investor. Responsibilities of the entrepreneur: mix and sell lemonade with honesty and good cheer. Smile at every customer. Keep the stand tidy. Responsibilities of the investor: provide lemons, sugar, cups, and ice. Assist in carrying the table and chair to the driveway. Supervise until closing time. Profits: 70% to the entrepreneur, 30% to the investor. To be applied toward outstanding babysitting bill. Signed, Lily Whitaker, entrepreneur James Whitaker, investor." I slid the page toward her with a flourish. "Now, sign here." She grabbed the pen eagerly, scrawling her name in big, uneven letters. "This makes it official, right?" "Very official," I said, shaking her hand solemnly. "Congratulations, you're in business." We spent the next hour preparing. She squeezed lemons with all her might, wincing when the juice stung a paper cut. I showed her how to stir sugar into warm water until it dissolved, then how to mix it with the tart juice. Together, we carried a card table to the end of the driveway, draped it with an old checkered cloth, and set out a hand-lettered sign she had made in crayon, "Lemonade 50. Customers arrived slowly, at first 2 neighborhood kids, a jogger, with earbuds, then Mrs. Collins from next door, her eyebrow arched as always. "So this is where the contract led," she said, fishing 2 quarters from her purse. Lily grinned as she poured carefully, handing over the cup with both hands like it was treasure. An hour later, business was brisk. Cars slowed, neighbors waved, coins clinked into the jar. Lily worked with focus, counting change, wiping spills, thanking each customer with a practiced smile. Every so often, she'd glance back at me, her eyes sparkling with a pride that no ledger could capture. By the time we packed up, the jar held nearly $12 in coins and crumpled bills. She poured them onto the table inside, counting each with exaggerated care. $8.40 for me," she announced. $3.60 for you," I nodded. "And that, young lady, reduces your babysitting bill to $116.40. She groaned but laughed, sweeping her share into a small tin. "I'll get there one day." I placed the contract back into the ledger, smoothing its edges. "What matters isn't the total. It's that you learned work has value, and agreements make it clear." That evening, after she'd gone home, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the signed page. The ink was crooked, the letters uneven, but the promise was there. Not just a promise of lemonade and profit, but of a child beginning to understand what time and effort meant. And as the sun set, golden across the quiet street, I realized that real profit wasn't $3.60. It was watching her discover that dignity and value don't just live in ledgers. Sometimes, they sparkle in a jar of quarters, and the grin of a girl who's learning what it means to pay her debts and more than hugs. The following week brought a hush over the house. Not because Lily was absent. She arrived each afternoon with the The same thunder of sneakers and laughter, but because the ledger itself grew quieter. It had sat on the counter for weeks now, its pages filled with tallies and notes. But lately, I hadn't picked up the pencil as quickly. Something about the weight of all those numbers, all those hours recorded, felt heavy in my hands. On Monday, Lily noticed before I did. She dropped her backpack, pulled open the ledger, and frowned. "You didn't write down the lemonade stand profits yet," she said. I adjusted my glasses, stirring sugar into my tea. "No, I suppose I didn't." She studied me for a moment. "Why not?" I shrugged. "Some things don't need to be written every time. Some things live in memory." Her brow furrowed, and she tapped the page with her finger. "But you always said the ledger matters. You said it shows that time is valuable." "It does," I said softly. "But sometimes the lesson settles deeper than the paper." She tilted her head, clearly not satisfied. "Grandpa, are you giving up the ledger?" The question lingered in the air, mixing with the hum of the old refrigerator and the steady tick of the hallway clock. I looked at her, her eyes bright with expectation, and realized she had grown attached to the ritual. It wasn't just my experiment anymore. It was ours. "No," I said finally. "I'm not giving it up. I'm just letting it rest for a bit. Even ledgers need silence now and then." She closed it gently, as though it were fragile, then carried it to the shelf beside the old cookbooks. "Then we'll give it a nap," she said with a small smile. For the rest of the week, we carried on without writing. Tuesday brought homework. Wednesday brought a game of checkers that ended with her crowing in victory. Thursday brought grilled cheese sandwiches eaten on the porch while we listened to the cicadas buzz. Each day, I thought of logging the hours, of marking down the time, but I didn't. I let the moment stand without ink. On Friday evening, as the rain pattered softly outside, Lily curled on the couch beside me, her head resting on my arm. "You know, Grandpa," she said, her voice drowsy. "I think I like it better without the ledger." "Oh," I asked, smoothing her hair. "Yeah, because then it's just us, not numbers, just being together." Her words struck me with a gentle truth. I had created the ledger to teach her that love and labor carried value, that hours meant something. But perhaps the truest lesson was this: once you recognize the worth, you don't need the record anymore. The value becomes self-evident. I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "You might be right, Lily." We sat in silence after that. The only sound the soft percussion of rain against the windows and the steady ticking of the clock. The ledger slept on its shelf, its pages already filled with lessons, its silence speaking louder than any numbers could. Later, when she had gone home and the house was quiet again, I walked into the kitchen and glanced at the shelf. The ledger sat there, closed, content. It wasn't gone, only resting. And I understood that the true measure of these days wasn't in tallies or invoices. It was in her laughter echoing down the hallway, in her small hand curled around mine, in the knowledge that she had begun to see value where once she had seen only babysitting. The silent ledger had done its work, and in its quiet, I found peace. It was a Sunday afternoon when Anne, my daughter, came by with a casserole dish in one hand and a furrowed brow on her face. She didn't often visit unannounced. Her nursing shifts kept her busy, and when she did come, it was usually planned days ahead. That day, though she arrived in a rush, setting the casserole on my counter with a thud. "Dad," she began, pulling off her coat, "I need to talk to you about Lily." I adjusted my glasses, leaning on my cane. "She's fine. She was here yesterday, helped me fold towels, and ate more pancakes than should be humanly possible." And pressed her lips into a line. "I'm not saying she's not fine. I'm saying she's talking a lot to people about this babysitting bill." I smiled faintly. "Ah, the famous invoice. Don't you me?" she said, jabbing a finger toward the fridge where the paper still fluttered under the Apple magnet. "She told her teacher you charge her. She told her friends' parents. She even told Pastor Miller during youth group." I chuckled. "Then the lesson is spreading." "Lesson," she said, exasperated. "Dad, people think you're actually charging your granddaughter money you know she doesn't have." I eased myself into a chair and gestured for her to do the same. "Sit down, Anne. Let me explain." She sat reluctantly, crossing her arms like she was back in high school waiting out a lecture. I folded my hands on the table. "When Lily first called me just a babysitter, it stung," I said. "I didn't want her to grow up thinking the hours I spent, the rides, the meals, the board games, were nothing. So I made a ledger. I showed her that even love takes labor, and labor has value." Anne's face softened, but only slightly. You could have just told her. I could have. I agreed. But children don't always hear words. They see actions. They understand stories. A bill on the fridge made her stop, think, ask questions. And she's learning. Not just about money, about gratitude, dignity, the value of time. Anne sighed, glancing at the invoice. She told me she owes you $120. Do you know what that did to her? She's been trying to think of ways to pay you back. Lemonade stands, chores, even saving her allowance. She's worried. Dad, I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. And did you also notice? She's proud. That she wants to pay me back, not because I asked, but because she values what I give. Anne hesitated, blinking. She did say she wanted to earn your respect. That she wanted to balance the ledger. There it is, I said softly. She's learning that love is not free, but it's freely given. That care deserves recognition. I don't care about the money, Anne. I care about her seeing me not as background noise, but as part of her life. For a long moment, Anne was quiet. Then she looked at me with eyes that carried both frustration and something gentler. You know, Dad, you've always had a way of teaching through stubbornness. And you turned out all right, I said, with a wink. She laughed despite herself, shaking her head. Maybe better than all right. Fine. Leave your ledger. Let her count. But if she grows up thinking she owes the world money for every bit of kindness, that's on you. I squeezed her hand. No. She grow up knowing kindness is priceless, and that's the balance I want her to carry. That evening, after Anne left, I stood alone in the kitchen. The casserole cooled on the counter. The invoice still fluttered on the fridge, and I realized something simple. I wasn't teaching Lily about debt. I was teaching her about worth. And perhaps, in her own way, Anne saw that too. The first crisp Saturday of October carried the smell of apples and cinnamon through the town square. The farmer's market had returned, with stalls lined up like bright patchwork quilts, pumpkins piled high, jars of honey glinting like amber, bread loaves steaming in brown paper. Lily tugged at my sleeve as we walked between the booths, her eyes darting from kettle corn to hand-carved toys. Grandpa, she whispered, do people really make money selling this stuff? Like a lot. They make what their work is worth, I told her, leaning on my cane as we paused at a stall where an elderly couple sold jars of jam. Sometimes more, sometimes less. But everything here has two values. The cost of the labor, and the meaning it carries. She squinted at the handwritten sign. Strawberry jam, $6. $6 for one jar, but it's just strawberries and sugar. The woman behind the table overheard and smiled. Not just strawberries, sweetheart. Hours of picking, stirring, canning, and labeling. $6 keeps the farm running. Lily flushed but nodded. Politely, we walked on, her hand warm in mine. At the next booth, a man sold handmade wooden birds. The price tag startled her again. $30, she whispered. For one birdhouse. I chuckled. That's not wood, Lily. That's time. Sanding, painting, hammering. It's also care. When you pay $30, you're not buying just a place for birds. You're honoring the hands that made it. She fell quiet as we moved deeper into the market. I could see her thoughts turning, her eyes sharper now, not just scanning for treats but measuring what they meant. Finally, she tugged me toward a stand selling lemonade. Grandpa, she said, pointing to the sign lemonade, $1.50. We charged 50 cents. Why are they charging 3 times as much? Overhead, I explained. They paid for the permit, the bigger table, the fancy sign, maybe even helpers. That's the cost of growing a business. Her mouth formed a small O. Then she asked, do you think people will still buy it? We watched together as a man in a suit handed over a $5 bill and walked away with a lemonade and a smile. Seems so, I said. We bought apples, cheese, and a small loaf of bread, then found a bench under the oak trees at the edge of the square. Lily bit into her apple, juice dribbling down her chin, and stared at the crowd. Grandpa, she said thoughtfully, everything here costs more than I thought, but people still pay. Because they see it. I smiled. Exactly. They see the work. That's what I wanted you to learn with the ledger. Love is work, too. You can't put it on a shelf like jam, or sell it in a jar. But it's worth something. All the same, she chewed slowly, then whispered, so your babysitting bill, it's like your jam stand. I laughed softly. In a way, yes, though I don't expect anyone to hand me $6 a jar. She leaned against me, the apple core sticky in her palm. I think I get it now. People pay because they respect the work. And even if I don't pay you with money, I can still respect the work. I pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, my throat tightening. That's the lesson, Lily. Respect, that's all. We finished our bread and cheese, the market buzzing around us. When we finally stood to leave, Lily looked back at the rows of booths, her face solemn. Next time, she said, let's bring the ledger. I want to write down how much today was worth. And as we walked home, the autumn leaves crackling under our feet, I realized the market hadn't just sold us apples and jam. It had sold Lily a truth, that value is never about the sticker price alone. It's about the story, the hands, and the hours behind it. The Monday after our trip to the market began like most school days. Lily's hurried knock at my door, the thump of her backpack on the floor, and the quick chatter about multiplication tables and playground drama. But there was a seriousness in her eyes that morning, something that didn't match the usual whirlwind. She set her backpack on the kitchen table and unzipped it carefully, pulling out a folded sheet of lined paper. She smoothed it flat with her palms before sliding it toward me. "Grandpa," she said, her voice small, "I wrote this for you." I adjusted my glasses and unfolded the page. Across the top, in Lily's uneven handwriting, were the words, "I'm sorry." I read aloud softly. "Dear Grandpa, I'm sorry," I said. "You're just a babysitter." I didn't understand then. I didn't know that you gave up your time and energy. For me, I didn't know that even when you were tired, you still played games and cooked pancakes and helped me with homework. Now I see it. I see you. I don't know how to pay back the bill, but I'll spend my whole life trying. Love, Lily. The words blurred slightly as my eyes watered. I set the paper down carefully, as though it might break, and looked at her. She was biting her lip, waiting. "Oh, Lily," I said, my voice rough. "You never owed me an apology. But this," I tapped the paper, "this is worth more than any payment you could give." She tilted her head, her hair falling into her face. "But I wanted you to know I mean it. I didn't just want to hug it away. I wanted to write it down, like you do in the ledger." Her words struck me with a quiet force. All this time I'd been teaching her that care deserves record, that love has weight, that words written in ink can outlast hours. And here she was, turning the lesson back on me. I reached across the table, taking her small hand in mine. "Then let me write something to..." I pulled the ledger from the shelf and opened it to a clean page. At the top, I wrote, "Paid in full." Beneath it, in slow, careful strokes, I added, "By love, by laughter, by apology freely given." Lily's eyes widened. "Does that mean I don't owe you any more?" I smiled. "It means the debt is gone. Not because it was ever about money, but because love cancels every ledger." She grinned so wide it nearly split her face. "So I'm free." "You're free," I said. "Though I'll still expect hugs. And maybe pancakes on Saturdays when you're old enough to cook them for me." She laughed, the sound bright as bells. "Deal." The rest of the morning carried a different air. She helped me sweep the porch, humming as she worked. At lunch, she offered to set the table without being asked. And when her mother came to pick her up, Lily threw her arms around me tighter than usual, whispering, "Thank you for forgiving me." After they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table, her note still lying open. I read it again, slower this time, savoring every imperfect letter, every earnest word. I realized that in one short page, she had understood everything I had been trying to teach her. Care matters. Sacrifice matters. Gratitude matters. That evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the walls in amber light, I tucked her note into the ledger, not as a payment, not as a record, but as a keepsake. A reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons don't come from speeches or ledgers. They come from the courage of a child who chooses to say, "I see you." And in that moment, I felt richer than any bill could ever make me. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that already felt brittle. The sky was low and gray, the house cool with autumn's creeping chill. Lily had bounded in after school with her usual energy, but I noticed her steps were a little clumsier than usual, her backpack swinging wide as she spun down the hallway. The accident came fast. A crash, sharp as thunder, echoed from the sitting room. I hurried in, leaning hard on my cane, and there it was. The vase, Margaret's vase. Blue porcelain, hand-painted with tiny white blossoms, lying in jagged shards across the hardwood floor. Lily stood frozen beside it, her hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Grandpa," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't looking." For a moment, I couldn't speak. That vase had sat on the mantel for decades, a gift Margaret and I had bought at a roadside shop on our 15th anniversary. I remembered her laughter as she haggled with the vendor, her delight when she carried it back to the car, the way it glowed in the sunlight. Seeing it broken on the floor felt like seeing her smile slip away. Lily's eyes filled with tears. "I'll pay you back," she blurted. "I promise. I'll use my allowance. All of it. I'll sell more lemonade. I'll—" Her voice cracked. "Please don't be mad." I steadied myself, breathing deep. My first instinct was to mourn, not the porcelain itself, but the memory it carried. Yet, as I looked at Lily, trembling and guilty, I realized the lesson before us wasn't about a vase. It was about grace. "Come here," I said softly. She stepped forward hesitantly, as though afraid she might break something else with her very presence. I crouched as best I could, my knees protesting, and placed my hand on her shoulder. "Do you remember what we said about the ledger?" She sniffled. "That love cancels the debt." "Exactly," I said. "And love is stronger than broken things, stronger than vases, stronger than accidents." Her lip quivered. "But it was Grandma's." "Yes," I said, my throat tight. "It was Grandma's, and it hurts to see it gone. But you are here. You are safe. That matters more." We cleaned the shards together, me holding the dustpan steady, while she swept carefully, tears dripping down her cheeks. I told her stories of Margaret as we worked, how she once dropped a cake fresh from the oven and laughed until she cried. How she believed nothing broken was ever truly wasted if it taught you something. When the floor was clean, I led Lily to the table. She still looked solemn, weighed down by guilt. I pulled the ledger close and opened it to the page where her apology note was tucked. Then, on the next blank line, I wrote, "Debt for broken vase. Forgiven. Paid in full by presence and love." I slid the ledger toward her. "They're done." She stared at the words, then back at me. Slowly, a smile crept across her tear-streaked face. "Really? Really?" I said. "You don't owe me for accidents. You owe me for living with care, and you do that every day." She threw her arms around me then, nearly knocking my glasses askew. Her hug was fierce, desperate, but full of relief. I held her close, the smell of autumn leaves clinging to her hair, and whispered, "Some things can be replaced. Some can't. But nothing, not even broken porcelain, can replace you." That night, when the house was quiet, I sat before the empty space on the mantel. For a while, it looked bare, but then I realized it wasn't empty at all. Margaret's memory didn't live in porcelain. It lived in the laughter and forgiveness still filling the rooms of this house. And maybe, I thought, that was the real lesson the vase had left us. Some debts aren't measured in money, but in the mercy we choose to give. The days after the vase incident carried a softer rhythm. Lily seemed quieter, more thoughtful, as though the crash had shaken something inside her beyond fear of punishment. One Friday afternoon, after her homework was done and the kitchen still smelled faintly of tomato soup, she climbed onto the stool across from me with a serious look on her face. "Grandpa," she said, "can we count? Like, really count how many hours you've babysat me?" I raised an eyebrow over my glasses. "That's a tall order, Lily. We'd need more fingers and toes than the two of us combined." "I don't care," she said, setting her jaw. "I want to know." So I pulled the ledger from its place on the shelf and opened it on the table. The pages were already lined with entries: rides to school, meals cooked, games played, but she wanted more than a ledger's fragments. She wanted the sum. "All right," I said, sharpening my pencil. "Let's start from the beginning. You were born in June of 2015. Your mother went back to work when you were barely 3 months old. Do you remember who rocked you in the afternoons?" Then, she shook her head, eyes wide. "That was me," I said. "Every day, 3 hours, until your mama came home." I scribbled a note. "Let's say 3 hours, 5 days a week, for 6 months. That's," I paused for effect, 360 hours. Her mouth fell open. 360, just for rocking me. I nodded. "And that was before you could even talk back." We moved year by year. I reminded her of the mornings she spent in my kitchen before preschool, the afternoons of finger painting, the weekends I sat through recitals where her violin screeched like a freight train. Each memory came with a number: 10 hours, 20, sometimes hundreds. By the time we reached her current age, the pencil mark sprawled across 2 pages. The total made us both sit back in silence. "Over 5,000 hours," I said at last, the number startling even me. Lily whistled low, like she'd just seen a magician pull a rabbit from a hat. "That's, Grandpa, that's like 1,000,000 babysitting bills." I laughed, shaking my head. "Not quite, but it's enough to prove a point." She leaned forward, tracing the totals with her finger. You could have been doing anything else with that time. Working, sleeping, watching TV. I could have, I agreed. But I chose this. Because those hours built you. And in building you, they built me too. Her eyes shimmered, and she whispered, I never knew it was that much. That's why we counted, I said gently. So you'd see. Hours are like bricks, you don't notice how many it takes until the house is standing. She smiled faintly, then scribbled something at the bottom of the page in big, uneven letters. Payment, forever grateful. I didn't stop her. In fact, I underlined it. When her mother arrived that evening, Lily carried the ledger to the car, insisting and see the total. I watched from the porch as she explained it with wild gestures, her voice carrying across the yard. Anne met my eyes and gave me a small nod. One of those rare, silent acknowledgments that said, she understands now. You've done it. Later that night, I sat alone at the table. The ledger opened before me. The number 5,000 glowed in the lamplight. But it wasn't the math that mattered. It was the truth behind it. A lifetime of hours, quietly given. Now finally seen. And for the first time since I'd started this experiment, I felt the ledger didn't just teach Lily. It reminded me, too, that love, when measured honestly, always outweighs its cost. Saturday mornings always carried their own rhythm. The sunlight came through the curtains at a gentler angle. The kettle whistled slower, and the whole house seemed to breathe easier. Lily arrived a little later than usual, bouncing up the porch steps with her backpack slung over one shoulder and her hair in a messy braid. She burst through the door, waving a crumpled envelope like a victory flag. "Grandpa," she shouted, "I brought money." I raised my eyebrows over my glasses. "Money for what?" "For you," she said, slapping the envelope down on the kitchen table. Coins rattled and rolled, one quarter spinning in circles before clattering flat. "It's my allowance. $20. I want to pay down my babysitting bill," I chuckled, leaning on my cane as I shuffled closer. "Allowance, you say? That's supposed to be for comic books, nail polish, and bubblegum." She crossed her arms, serious as a banker. "I don't need nail polish. I need to pay you back." I sat slowly, pulling the ledger toward me. "Well now, let's see. Your outstanding balance stands at $116.40, with a payment of $20. That brings us to—" I paused, scribbling figures with my pencil. $96.40. Her eyes brightened. "Under 100. "Yes," I said, with mock solemnity. A milestone indeed. But even as I played along, my heart tugged at the sight of her emptying her little envelope. Dimes and nickels, carefully saved, clinked onto the table. Every coin was a sacrifice, a piece of candy, not bought, a toy left on a shelf. And here she was, laying them out with pride. "Grandpa," she said, "do you think I'll ever pay it all?" "Really?" I tapped the ledger thoughtfully. "You could. But let me ask you why. Do you want to?" She hesitated, fidgeting with a penny. "Because it's fair. You did the work. I owe you." "Fair," I repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, it's fair. But is it the only way?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice as if sharing a secret. "Sometimes, debts can be paid in more than one currency. Money is one way. Gratitude is another. And then there's the rarest kind, living in a way that honors the gift you were given." Her brow furrowed, and she chewed her lip. "So, if I live well, that's like paying you back." "In a way," I said softly. "Every time you show kindness, every time you stand tall with dignity, every time you carry love into the world, you're repaying all those hours. Not to me, but through me." She leaned back, considering this. Then she shook her head stubbornly. "I'm still paying with money too. I want to." I laughed. "Fair enough. The ledger will take both." We counted the coins together, stacking quarters and lining up nickels until the total reached $20 exactly. I marked it in the book, Lily watching closely as though the numbers carried magic. "Payment received," I said, closing the ledger with a theatrical thump. "The great allowance debate is settled for now." She grinned, satisfied, and skipped off to the living room, humming to herself. When she was gone, I opened the ledger again, touching the fresh ink. $96.40. It was still a debt on paper, but in truth, she had already overpaid, not with coins, but with the sight of her determination, the weight of her sincerity, the way her young heart reached for fairness even when she didn't fully understand it. I closed the book once more, sliding it back onto the shelf. Some debates never end, I thought. They simply shift. But if this was how Lily wanted to fight hers, with envelopes of coins and the fierce desire to honor the Aruzai, was more than willing to keep the ledger open. Because the real balance wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in love multiplied. And that column was already overflowing. The first frost of November painted the yard silver. I woke early that morning, the cold biting even through the window panes. And for a while, I simply sat at the kitchen table, watching my breath rise faintly in the air. The ledger lay open before me, its pages worn soft at the edges, its pencil marks faded in places where the eraser had rubbed away mistakes. It was no longer just a book, it was a story, stitched together by numbers, notes, and lessons. Lily arrived later, bundled in a scarf too long for her, the ends dragging like a royal train behind her. She stamped snow from her boots, cheeks flushed pink, and greeted me with a grin. "Morning, Grandpa, ready for hot cocoa?" I poured the milk into a pan, letting the warmth spread through the kitchen as the smell of chocolate filled the air. We sat together, her cup brimming with marshmallows, mine plain. For a while, we drank in silence. The only sound, the steady tick of the clock, and the occasional crackle of the radiator. Then she noticed the ledger. "You left it open," she said, setting her cup down. "Are you adding something?" "No," I said gently. "I think I'm finishing something." Her brow knit. "Finishing?" I pushed the book toward her. The final page was nearly blank, only a few faint smudges where my hand had rested earlier. At the top, in slow, careful letters, I had written, "Final entry." She read it aloud, her voice hushed. "Final entry." I nodded. This ledger began as a lesson. A way to show you that hours matter, that time isn't free, that love carries weight. But now, Lily, you've learned. You've seen it in coins, in contracts, in broken vases and market stalls. You've carried it in your heart. The ledger has done its work. She stared at the page, her small fingers tracing the words. "So, you're closing it?" "Yes," I said, "because some lessons aren't meant to be counted forever. They're meant to be lived." Her lip quivered. "But if you close it, how will I know what I owe you?" I leaned across the table, resting my hand over hers. "You don't owe me, Lily. You never really did. The ledger wasn't about debt, it was about recognition. And now you recognize it. That's all I ever wanted." Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, determined not to let them fall. She straightened her shoulders, just as I had seen her do at the lemonade stand, and whispered, "Then let me write something." I slid the book toward her. She picked up the pencil with care, the eraser already worn flat from weeks of tallies. At the bottom of the page, beneath my final entry, she wrote in large, uneven letters, "Thank you. Paid in love." I watched her, my chest tightening, my eyes blurring. When she set the pencil down, I closed the ledger gently, pressing my palm against the cover as though sealing a promise. "There," I said softly, "it's closed." The rest of the day carried a quiet peace. We played a game of Scrabble, her words sprawling awkwardly across the board. We baked cookies, the kitchen warm with sugar and cinnamon. And when Anne arrived to take her home, Lily clutched the ledger under her arm. "Can I keep it?" she asked, her eyes shining. I hesitated, then nodded. "It's yours now. A record, a reminder, and maybe one day, a gift you'll pass on." She hugged me tightly before leaving, the ledger pressed between us. That evening, as the frost deepened outside and the stars pricked the sky, I sat in the stillness of the kitchen. The shelf where the ledger had always rested was empty, but I didn't feel loss. I felt completion. The lesson had been given, received, and carried forward. And in that quiet moment, I realized something simple and profound. The ledger had always been temporary. The love it measured was not.